Our story starts with a powerful king named Gray. He wasn't buying that whole light at the end of the tunnel thing after death. Not until, well, he died. One minute he's surveying his city, the next he's staring at a bright light. Turns out, the myths were true-ish. Except, instead of floating off to some heavenly afterlife, Gray found himself getting squeezed into a much smaller place. Yep. He was reborn as a baby. His new name? Arthur. Not exactly the kingly title he was used to. Arthur's new parents, Alice and Reynolds, were the best. Alice, kind and strong, basically ran the show. Reynolds? A reliable dude, but with a goofy streak a mile wide. Arthur, wise king in a tiny body, appreciated the loving family. Still, being a baby wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. No fighting battles, no fancy speeches, just drool, diapers, and the occasional blowout, and trust us, those were no laughing matter. One thing did confuse Arthur. Everyone spoke the same language, but they wore armor, carried weapons, and lived in what looked like a history book come to life. Then, one day, he saw his mom heal a scratch with a flick of her wrist. Magic. That's right, Arthur wasn't just reborn. He was reborn in a world where magic was real. This little king with a big brain and a tiny body had a new plan. Use his past life knowledge to rise to the top of this magical world. Forget leading armies and conquering nations. In this life, Arthur, the former king reborn as a drool monster, achieved his greatest feat yet, crawling. But conquering the living room wasn't enough. This tiny mastermind craved knowledge. By night, while his parents snored, blissfully unaware of their son's nocturnal adventures, Arthur embarked on daring raids into his father's library. He discovered he was in Decathlon, a continent ruled by 3 grand kingdoms. Eleanor, a magical elven haven nestled deep in the forest. Darv, a subterranean dwarven stronghold, literally rocking the underworld scene. Sapin, the human kingdom, bustling with the most citizens, and probably the most noise. Unlike his old world, royalty wasn't a participation trophy here. It was all about family trees, not epic duels. Decathlon also seemed stuck in a technological stone age, thanks to magic. In Arthur's past life, they had Ki, an inner force that powered warriors and their weapons. Here, they had mana, a similar energy but with a twist. It existed both inside and outside the body. There were 2 main ways to use mana. Enhancers, super soldiers who pumped mana into their bodies for insane strength, speed, and defense. Downside? They couldn't fight a fly from 10 feet away. Spellcasters. These folks channeled mana to manipulate the world around them. Fireballs, force fields. They needed extra mana from the environment to cast spells, though. Most focused on one element like fire or water, but some, like Arthur's mom, were diverters, able to cast various spells, like healing magic. Super useful when your tiny king crawls headfirst into a bookcase. Arthur was itching to learn more. This new world, with its magic and strange power systems, was a puzzle he craved to solve. There was one crucial difference between Arthur's old world and this new one: magic. Here, it wasn't about brute strength or endless training. It was all about genes. Only 1 in 100 kids were lucky enough to be born with the potential for magic, and that potential wouldn't even show up until puberty. This magic manifested as a mana core, a reservoir within the body. It sounded awfully similar to the Ki core Arthur remembered from his past life. Back then, warriors trained to gather Ki fragments and build a powerful core. Here, it seemed they just sat around and waited for puberty. Boring. A king doesn't wait for puberty. Arthur wasn't one for waiting. He closed his eyes, focused his mind, and felt a bunch of tiny mana fragments scattered within him. Just like with Ki, he could gather them. He started pulling them together, his tiny brow furrowed in concentration. Unfortunately, his attempts were always interrupted by his ever-watchful mother. 2 years flew by. Alice, Arthur's mother, couldn't help but notice her son's peculiarities. He wasn't interested in toys, but he'd spend hours mesmerized by the weapons in the city armory. He also had a strange habit of sneaking into his father's study, much to Alice's dismay. She worried about the kind of man Arthur would become. After all, she couldn't trust Reynolds, his father, who wanted to teach Arthur how to fight as soon as the boy could crawl. Arthur observed his father and quickly deduced he was an enhancer. While normal people might struggle to lift a rock, his dad could clear entire courtyards with a few minutes of concentration. Reynolds' training sessions were often, destructive. This time, he'd managed to uproot a massive tree. Alice stormed out to assess the damage, and Arthur seized his chance to continue his secret training. Over the past 2 years, Arthur had made significant progress with his mana core. He knew why it usually took until adolescence. Those fragments moved at a snail's pace. But Arthur wasn't built for patience. He forced the fragments together, defying the natural order. In just 2 years, what should have been a slow, pubescent process was complete. Suddenly, the house exploded. Reynolds, with reflexes honed from years of battle, snatched Alice away from the blast. But her only thought was for their son, Arthur, still inside. Ignoring the falling debris, Reynolds charged towards the wreckage. He couldn't believe his eyes. There stood Arthur, unharmed. Alice rushed over, her initial fear replaced by stunned awe. Her 2-year-old son had awakened his mana core. The prodigy emerges. Arthur felt a surge of power unlike anything he'd ever known. But that euphoria was short-lived. He looked around at their ruined home. Oops, Mom wasn't going to be happy. From that day on, things changed. Alice, ever the pragmatist, started teaching Arthur to read and write. Reynolds, between rebuilding projects, courtesy of Arthur's training, introduced him to the basics of magic and physical combat. Sure, swinging a wooden sword at 3 years old was awkward, but Arthur was determined. Every day, after his grueling training sessions, which Arthur secretly preferred over playtime, who needs video games when you can learn magic, he devoured books. The color of power. In this world, a person's strength was measured by their mana core's color. It started black, a reflection of impurities. As the core filtered these out, it became purer, changing color. The scale went from black to white, with white being the ultimate power. Each color had 3 stages: dark, solid, and clear. So, to reach orange from red, you had to progress through dark red, solid red, and clear red. Arthur was a prodigy. His core development was far outpacing his age. Reynolds, worried he was holding Arthur back, confessed to Alice, he needs a proper mentor, not just his goofball of a father. Alice wasn't thrilled about sending their 4-year-old off to a big city alone. But then, Arthur, ever the problem solver, spoke up. Why not all of us move to Xyrus, he suggested. How had they not thought of that before? Problem solved. They'd leave with their old friends, the Twin Horns, who were also heading to Xyrus. Their journey to the big city would begin the next day. Arthur was bursting with excitement to leave his sleepy little town. The next day, a proud Reynolds introduced his son to the Twin Horns. Adam Crench, a spear-wielding enhancer with a competitive streak. Angela Rosa, a graceful spellcaster who commanded the wind. Durden Walker, a hulking spellcaster who could shake the earth itself. Jasmine Flamesworth, a dual dagger enhancer with a fiery personality. Think Akame with a serious case of wanderlust. Helen Shard, a sharpshooting enhancer whose arrows flew true. The journey to Xyrus was long and treacherous. Arthur, the king reborn, was ready to take on a new challenge.